Our next principle is checks and balances. So a check is essentially a limit. So when we talk about checks in this particular case, we're talking about limits that the branches of governments place on their fellow branches. Now it's important to note that these limits are all happening at the federal level, so this is not the same thing as federalism. That has to do with checks between the federal and state governments. And so essentially what we're looking for are balances. We're looking for a balance of power between the three branches of government that we have in Washington, D.C. We don't want any one branch to become too powerful. And there are all kinds of ways throughout the Constitution where this appears. And of course, remember, the motivations are so clear. The early founders, they're really concerned about a government run amok with power. So what better way to keep the government in check than by having it check itself by dividing it up into branches and have them limit each other's power? So, some of the stuff is pretty basic. When a law is passed by Congress, it has to go to the President of the United States for approval. And the President can either approve it into law or they can do what's called a veto, where they reject that. But as a countermeasure, if a President vetoes a law and Congress decides that it's a really good law and they would like to pass it anyway, if 2/3 of Congress agrees, they can override a presidential veto. You might remember us talking about this recently with legislation that was meant to allow victims of 9/11's families sue Saudi Arabia. That legislation was passed, President Obama vetoed it, and then Congress ruled to override the president. Doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's a big deal. Other times, it's between different branches. So there's Nixon again. Nixon, after the Watergate scandal, had recorded conversations that he had in the Oval Office. And when the existence of these tapes was discovered, the American public wanted them. And Nixon said that he had a thing called executive privilege, where, as the President of the United States, he could not be compelled, he could not be forced to make these audio tapes public from the Oval Office. And essentially, this went to court. And the United States sued the President of the United States in a case, and I'm not making this up, called the United States versus Richard Nixon. And the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, ultimately ruled that Nixon, the executive branch, had to make those tapes public. And so they are public today, and that was a large part of Nixon's resignation. So here you have two branches of government directly opposed to each other. Other times, it's the Supreme Court versus the legislative. So flag burning, also known as flag desecration, is not illegal. It is an expression of your First Amendment rights. And so every time Congress has ever tried to pass a law against flag desecration, the Supreme Court has struck it down. Most notably, this happened in 1989. This time, Texas tried to pass a law against flag burning, flag desecration, and the Supreme Court said, no, that law would be unconstitutional. This is a form of freedom of expression. Other times, it's the executive versus the legislative. So in this particular time, it was the 1930s, and the man down in the lower right-hand corner is Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was trying to pass all kinds of legislation in the 1930s to get us out of the Great Depression. But some of it, Congress felt, was a little bit too overreaching. They thought he was abusing his power. And the Supreme Court felt the same way. The Supreme Court kept striking down laws that President Roosevelt was trying to make. So President Roosevelt tried to get Congress to pass legislation to expand the size of the Supreme Court, because if you remember, it is a president who appoints Supreme Court justices. So this was known as Roosevelt's court packing scheme, where he tried to expand the court so he could get more justices appointed by himself that would be friendlier to the things he was trying to get done. And eventually Congress fought back. It did not pass the legislation that Roosevelt wanted to pass, and so the Supreme Court remained the same. But either way, in any of these cases, you've got one branch of the federal government conflicting with another one. And you can make all kinds of arguments about which branch is the most powerful today, legislative, judicial, or executive. But that's the idea of checks and balances. Thanks for watching.